U.S. President Donald Trump renews his attacks against China as tensions flare between the two economic powers. Hello, I'm Anand Naidoo, and this is The Heat. The future of China-U.S. relations is hitting choppy waters after President Trump threatens to cut ties over China's handling of the coronavirus pandemic, adding he's in no mood to talk to Chinese President Xi Jinping. Tensions between Washington and Beijing have ratcheted up since the White House blamed the coronavirus on a lab in Wuhan, a claim that Beijing strongly denies. More on that later, but first let's go to CGTN's White House correspondent Nathan King. And Nathan, here in the United States, more bad news on the economic front. Millions of Americans filing for jobless claims once again.
Yeah, over 3 million again this week, just quite incredible. 30 million people now. The unemployment rate's gone way past 15%. Remember, it was below 4 before COVID-19, and you know, it's really just been essentially put into a medical coma. Essentially, that's why the economy is shut down. So, you know, the big question is how quickly can the economy come back? Now, as you know, the U.S. president, he was in Pennsylvania earlier today, Allentown, talking about opening up the economy. But the big question is how many of those jobs are going to come back? You know, you have had so much stimulus. You've had the payment protection program, a lot of companies on life support. But what we don't have is essentially demand, unless we're talking about groceries. By the way, prices on groceries haven't been as high as this in 50 years, which is also hitting Americans. So the big question is, does the U.S. Congress put more stimulus in? And this is where we're at the moment. $3 trillion spent, but another $3 trillion bill was put out this week by House Democrats, focusing on aid to states and frontline workers and more checks to individuals. But as you know, party politics always plays into this, and there's a sort of wait-and-see attitude from congressional Republicans, although you can tell with this White House, they really want to do everything they can to stop the economy falling off a cliff.
Nathan, one other development in Washington on Thursday. We also heard congressional testimony from Dr. Richard Bright. He is a senior advisor at the National Institutes of Health. He said the U.S. missed early warning signals and wasn't prepared. How important was this House hearing?
Very important. You said it, National Institutes of Health. That's his new job. His old job was essentially in the administration searching for vaccines. And he was very much part of the treatment and vaccine search for COVID-19. And one of the reasons he said, he's a whistleblower now, one of the reasons he said he was moved out of his job was because he pushed back on administration efforts to try untested treatments like hydroxychloroquine and the others. But that was not the only reason that he thinks he was forced out, and he gave a very damning picture of what's been happening behind the scenes, according to Rick Bright. Basically ignored warnings, a mess when it comes to procuring the right equipment, always behind the curve, infighting within the administration. And you know what, he says it's not over. He says that, you know, despite all the masks and the testing that we've seen, the US government is still behind the curve, and if they don't right things by this winter, he says it's going to be the worst winter in modern history. So it was a very stark warning, and also followed on from Dr. Anthony Fauci, who gave testimony to the Senate, as you know, by video conference, who's one of the key members of the coronavirus task force. And he was basically saying, watch out for opening up this economy too quickly. You're going to see spikes. You could see all the economic gains that you're thinking you're going to get rolled back. So we've had two warnings from two officials, one former official who's been moved out. And it's very, very indicative, at least to those of us who cover the White House, that the science and the health people are on a completely different page from the political appointees here.
All sounds very distressing. Nathan King, CGTN's White House correspondent. Thanks, Nathan. Now, earlier I spoke with Max Baucus. He is the former U.S. ambassador to China, and asked him what he thought of the deteriorating China-U.S. relations, all coming amid the global coronavirus pandemic.
It's not good. In fact, I think it's the chasm, the gulf between our two countries is deepening and it's widening. And it's going so far to such a degree that it's going to be difficult to put Humpty Dumpty back together again say after the next election. We're not in very good shape. It's not good. And there are a lot of reasons why we're in such bad shape, but it's not good.
Well, let's look at some of those reasons. President Trump and other senior members of his administration have accused China of a lack of transparency, of a cover-up in informing the world of this coronavirus outbreak. Yet, if we look at a timeline of what happened, we see that China was being as open as it could at the time.
That would be my guess, too. And that's my reading of the information, of the data. I mean, to some degree, we have to remember China is China. That is, some of the local officials first were a bit surprised when they learned about the virus. Second, they didn't want to embarrass their superiors. There's a cultural tendency in China, because it's somewhat top-down, not to give those above you bad news. And I add to that sort of the bureaucracy. China is quite bureaucratic. So it probably took some time for the country to respond and to begin to lock down Wuhan the way it did.
Right, because if we look at the information that came out of China, it was heard around the world. Countries like Singapore, South Korea, New Zealand, for instance, they had the same information, and they were able to act very quickly in flattening that curve.
That's right. It's unfortunate that the United States response was so slow. It was basically a disorganized response. Partly it's because of the United States form of government. We're a constitutional democracy. We're not even a parliamentary democracy. We're not authoritarian. So it's difficult for different agencies in different states to coordinate to get a good, solid response. We were asleep at the switch anyway. We were late, like a lot of other countries were, in not developing a response to something like this. But anyway, we were slow.
And if we look at one of the other more ominous developments, we've heard from the U.S. Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, who says that he has, quote, enormous evidence that the coronavirus came from a laboratory in the city of Wuhan. He's provided none of that evidence. And in fact, he's been contradicted by his own Director of National Intelligence, as well as Dr. Anthony Fauci, who is the Director at the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases and one of the leading spokespeople on the outbreak here in the United States. So is the White House spreading disinformation here, and for what reason?
I am quite put out with Secretary Pompeo's statement. He has backed off a little bit when he realized that the weight of the scientific community was opposed to what he was saying. Essentially, the relationship between the U.S. and China was deteriorating anyway, partly because of the trade deal, and more importantly because of the tariffs that President Trump slapped on China. Then when the coronavirus came along, it just made matters worse. First of all, it came from China, not from some other country. That didn't help the relationship. Add to that, the virus has dramatically slowed down the economies, both China, the U.S., and others around the world. And that's caused unemployment in the U.S. It's caused lots of people in the U.S. to wonder about their next paycheck. And they somewhat blame China for that. And so the coronavirus has made matters worse. And on top of that, Pompeo was criticizing China. The Republican Party has issued a 57-page memo, a guide to Republican senators and Republican House members on how to win the elections. And the key is to blame China. Blame China for the coronavirus. Blame China for job loss. Blame China for cover-up. Blame China. And that's adding a lot more to the tension between our two countries.
So would it be fair to say, Ambassador, that this is a lot of election politics that we're hearing right now, that President Trump, by blaming China, is basically deflecting attention away from his own handling of the coronavirus outbreak in this country, and in many instances, his own incompetence in dealing with that. In essence, he is scapegoating China for this, isn't he?
That's partly true. It is true that he is actually largely scapegoating China, but the division is deeper than that. And that question you just posed, someone assumes that once the election's over, things will get back to normal. They won't get back to normal. It's going to be very difficult to forge a stronger relationship, at least as strong as it was back, say, up until about 2013. Since from 2013 to Trump's election, it was sliding anyway. And then the coronavirus, and in my judgment, Trump's almost vitriolic bile toward China has made it worse. Add to that, There are a lot of pretty smart people in the United States who are not speaking up. People in office, moderates, especially moderates in the Republican side, who are afraid to speak up. They're intimidated. They're intimidated by Trump. And it's kind of slanting toward a form of McCarthyism, how it is politically incorrect to speak the truth, to speak truth to power. And that's also happening.
And if we look at some of the broader implications of what's taking place, what we're seeing from this deteriorating relationship, there was an op-ed in the New York Times published on Monday. It said, among other things, that going abroad in search of monsters to destroy won't save Americans from pandemics, but it does risk entangling the United States in a Cold War with the world's #2 power. Are we standing on the brink of what could be another Cold War?
I don't think so. It depends, what you mean by Cold War. The prior Cold War with the Soviet Union was much different. Then it was nukes pointed toward each other. Add to that, the Russian economy is much, much smaller than the Chinese economy. This time around, we're very tied to China, much more tied to China than we were to Russia back then. Economically, we are, even with the trade friction, we are. And second, no country is talking about nuclear war at all. But there is a lot of competition, and there are a lot of people in the United States who are concerned about China. I saw a Pew research poll recently which showed about 2/3 of Americans today have an unfavorable view of China. Now, that's probably because of some actions China's taken. A good example might be the South China Sea and some of the trade barriers, but it's also because of Americans concerned about their security. And partly it's because of companies like Huawei and ZTE are roundly criticized by the United States. And a lot of Americans are fearing that, Huawei, ZTE, other Chinese companies are spying on the United States. And that adds a lot of insecurity, too.
Yeah, when I said Cold War, I was thinking, at a time when countries should be cooperating with each other, coordinating their approaches to solving some of the world's bigger problems, like the pandemic, like climate change, like fighting terrorism and things like that. Could these two countries end up in a state of tension constantly, in a state of hostility all the time?
That's possible. It's very undesirable. It is possible that the United States is squandering its historical role as a world leader. We see Trump talking about America first, criticizing its allies, withdrawing from trade agreements, withdrawing from WHO, Paris Accord, et cetera. The United States is, under Trump anyway, is squandering its leadership and drifting. President Xi in China, I'm not sure he wants to be a world leader that fills that kind of void. They want to proceed with commercial economic growth, the Belt Road Initiative, for example. But it's very possible that the two major superpowers, that is the two largest countries in the world, could drift. And that's going to cause a lot more uncertainty in the world. It's going to cause lots of different countries to wonder, who do we align with, or do we align, and whatnot. It's very possible. I think we have to wait to see who is elected in November in the United States. If Donald Trump's reelected, I think it could be more of the same, probably, because he is who he is. Second, if Joe Biden is elected, then I think you'll see a president who is critical of China, but critical in a more responsible, predictable way, and who will work with world international institutions like the IMF, the UN, and WHO, et cetera. So if that happens, then I think that it's possible we'll come closer together. Look, at people in China, like the people in the United States, we all want the same thing. We all want to put food on the table, decent jobs. We want to take care of our kids, good education, have our governments address air and water pollution, healthcare, et cetera. We're Chinese people like American people. So if we just kind of take a deep breath and push the pause button a little bit, it's likely that we'll come around. At least I hope so.
Just getting back to your points on the possible outcomes of the November election, if we see President Trump lose re-election, if we have a new president, President Biden, do you see relations with China improving in many ways? I mean, will we see a return of the whole idea of multilateralism?
We will see Joe Biden attempting to establish the United States as a leader in the world, work with international institutions. He also will be very suspicious of trade agreements, frankly, not go back to the old liberal democratic views that, all trade agreements are good agreements. He'll be quite skeptical of trade agreements protecting American jobs. He probably will spend a lot of time on American infrastructure, build up America's economy, a lot more than President Trump has. I think you'll see certainly competition with China. I think you'll see a president, Joe Biden, who will not publicly criticize China near as much. I think he's more, he's smarter than that. He's has more gravitas. He won't do things like that because he knows that if he wants to work with China, he has to say things that don't upset China.
There seems to be agreement across party lines in the United States that there needs to be a lessening of U.S. dependence on China's manufacturing capabilities. We've heard President Trump talk about this numerous times. He wants to repatriate the manufacturing capabilities of China back to this country. I mean, realistically, do you see that happening?
Some of it will, but not a lot. American multinationals will do business where they get the greatest return. And that will be in the United States, but it'll also be in China, by far the world's largest market. Chinese middle class, about 400 million, will soon be larger than the entire population of the United States. They'll look at other countries as well. And I think, too, that almost red-hot tension you see right now will start to diminish. And when that happens, then I think we'll find a little more openness in the multilateral system, but with eyes wide open, very clear-eyed. We'll find Americans being a little more careful about building too many plants overseas, relying too much on other countries. Now, for example, our pharmaceutical industry very much depends upon China. Our semiconductor industry very much depends upon China. And if we decouple, if we go our own way, frankly, I think that's going to cause a lot more problems to solve, much more than people realize today.
President Trump spent much of the first 3 years in office engaging in what turned out to be a trade war with China. Then, of course, we have an agreement, the first phase of an agreement, and there was an agreement signed, and then we now have the pandemic. What do you make of that? Do you think that trade agreement's going to survive this? Is it in any kind of jeopardy?
I think it's in significant jeopardy. It essentially was penned, agreed to much before the coronavirus. And even then, it'd be difficult for China to buy $200+ billion in agriculture, manufacturing, and energy equipment as they promised. And at the same time, Trump would have to lower tariffs a very significant degree as part of that agreement. The coronavirus, though, has really thrown all that off into a very difficult patch because the economies of both countries have suffered such a blow. Consumers in China aren't buying near as much. They're not buying in the U.S. because of lockdown, stay at home, etc. And it's causing, make it almost impossible for China to live up to its commitments to buy that full $200 billion. So what do? I think that if we're adults, U.S. and China, we realize, hey, coronavirus has caused change of circumstances here. So let's just sit down. Let's renegotiate it. Let's negotiate in good faith.
Ambassador Max Baucus, thanks so much for your insights. Thanks for joining us.
You bet. Thank you.
All right, let's continue our discussion right now with our panel. Victor Gao is a CGTN current affairs commentator. He joins us from Beijing via Skype. And with us here in Washington, James P. Moore is the founder and CEO of the Washington Institute for Business, Government and Society. Well, welcome to both of you to the show. Victor, let me start with you and let's listen to some of the other comments that President Trump has been making. He said he's disappointed with China. He made those remarks in an interview with the Fox Business Network here in the United States. Let's listen to part of what he had to say.
Have you spoken to Xi Jinping?
I have a very good relationship, but
Right now, I don't want to speak to him. I don't want to speak to him.
Because, Senator Cotton was saying maybe we should be limiting the amount of visas that we give to students who want to study things like quantum computing.
There are many things.
And AI.
There are many things we could do. We could do things. We could cut off the whole relationship. Now, if you did, what would happen? You'd save $500 billion if you cut off the whole relationship.
So, Victor, when you hear sentiments like that from the United States president, what does it mean for the China-U.S. relationship?
Well, first of all, I would say the current status of China-U.S. relations is at the worst point ever since Dr. Henry Kissinger's secret visit to China in 1971 and former President Nixon's first official visit to China in 1972. It's the worst point ever since the normalization of China-U.S. relations in 1979. Now, let's assume for a moment President Donald Trump really got his wish. He completely shut off China-U.S. relations. In that scenario, does the American people benefit or lose? I would say in that scenario, the American people actually will lose more than whatever they can get. And the Chinese people will lose more than whatever we get. So this is a mutually destructive proposition that President Donald Trump was talking about. And this is shocking. And this is not befitting the president or the presidency of the largest superpower in the world. I think we deserve better. The people in the world deserve better for leadership in the White House. And I think China-U.S. relations really need to be managed and handled better for the mutual benefit of the American people as well as for the Chinese people.
All right, let me go to James. James, what is your view on this when you see and hear what we've just heard? I mean, President Trump there saying one of his options is to cut off the whole relationship.
Well, I don't think that's going to quite happen. You know, it's amazing, but we're celebrating this year the 40th year of the relationship between the United States and China. I was very much involved in the very early days when we were establishing a trading relationship that went beyond just a few goods between both of our countries during the Reagan administration. But there's no question that since I was on your program last, when we thought that the relationship was pretty bad, it's much worse today. And given the fact that we are dealing with some very difficult issues that this pandemic has actually helped to exploit, I think it's going to be a very, very difficult road ahead of us, and I'm not sure where it's going to end up.
James, we just heard Ambassador Baucus say that the trade deal that was just signed a few months ago could be in jeopardy. Do you agree with that?
I do, and again, this is really to come to pass in these coming months, but it's really going to depend on this upcoming election here in the United States. President Trump is going to continue to talk about the lack of transparency, the hacking that's going on, the cybersecurity as far as China is concerned. He'll be going down a list of things and really trying to convey to the American people that there are some bad guys on the other side of the Pacific Ocean. And so I think that as far as the trade agreements are concerned that were being put into place, I mean, to heck with, we were talking about some additional trade agreements that were going to begin to be negotiated. I think it's going to be very difficult, and President Trump certainly is going to be one who will have no hesitation whatsoever, given his record of backtracking on that trade agreement if he believes it's in the best interest of the United States.
Victor, I just want to get to a point that James raised there, and that these accusations coming out of the United States that China, as well as Iran, have been hacking U.S. institutes and research centers in an attempt to steal research, steal work that's being done on a vaccine. There has been a response from China on this. This information initially came from United States intelligence sources, unnamed sources, but there has been a response from China on this, and this is what the Chinese Foreign Ministry had to say. Let's listen.
With the current situation of the novel coronavirus epidemic spreading globally, any online attacks that impedes the effort to fight against the pandemic should be condemned by the people of the entire world. What I want to stress is that slander and accusations cannot eliminate the virus or stop the pandemic. We urge the U.S. to focus on saving lives, and play a more constructive role in U.S.-China cooperation in the fight against the pandemic and protect public health globally.
So, Victor, what do you read into these latest accusations?
Well, I think ever since President Donald Trump walked into the White House, there have been so many groundless and baseless accusations levied against China. And I think the United States need to come up with the real proof and the evidence to back up such accusations or allegations against China, because otherwise, I think they will become worthless, or even more worthless than the paper on which they may be written, and they are not even written on the paper. So I would say I agree with the point that mankind right now needs breakthrough in vaccine, in the remedies against coronavirus. This is the time for international cooperation. And the WHO has recently launched a fundraising effort to help focus the efforts on the vaccines. China pitched in, many other countries pitched in, and it's very, very unfortunate that the United States stayed away from that international effort. I think the United States government, President Donald Trump, and all the other American leaders really need to call upon societies at large, government agencies in the United States to join or even to lead the international effort in achieving the breakthrough in vaccines.
Okay, James, very quickly, I've only got a minute left, but we have an interesting scenario coming down the road, which is, of course, the United States election. I was talking about that with Ambassador Max Baucus just a moment ago. If President Trump loses his bid for a second term, if, as it seems right now, that Joe Biden becomes the next president of the United States, do you see a radical change in the relationship?
I do not see a radical change in the relationship. I think there have been some serious problems in regards to supply chains when it comes to manufacturing and what we're bringing into the United States. I think there are concerns of the lack of transparency in trying to figure out, for example, the origins of where the coronavirus came from. The notion that essentially the world will be able to explore and try to investigate exactly what happened should wait for another day while we simply deal with what we're dealing with right now, I think is unacceptable both for the Republicans and for the Democrats, and that's what we're going to contend with between now and November 3rd.
James Moore, Victor Garr, thanks to both of you for being with us.
Thank you.
And that is it for this edition of The Heat. I'm Anand Naidoo in Washington, D.C. Thanks for watching.